She was young, curious, and I was her mom's friend, too wise, too kind, too dangerous to love. Would you read? Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what drew you to this story tonight? Everything for someone new. The first time I saw him, I didn't know I would remember the moment so vividly years later. He wasn't loud or demanding, the kind of presence that fills a room with flashy energy. No, his presence was quiet, deliberate, like a deep note that resonates without effort. He stood slightly apart, observing the familiar chaos of a family gathering with a calm, measured patience. My mother, unaware of the quiet storm in my mind, laughed easily at his soft, knowing smile. There was something magnetic about him, the way he listened, the way he noticed things others missed. I couldn't stop my eyes from tracing his movements, subtle but deliberate, a nod here, a raised eyebrow there, the slow, thoughtful way he poured himself a glass of wine. I remember the first time our hands touched. He offered a handshake, polite and formal, but it lingered, not long enough to be bold, not brief enough to be dismissive. Just enough to make me aware of the warmth of his palm, the subtle firmness, the quiet strength beneath a calm exterior. It was disarming, and I felt a flutter in my chest I wasn't prepared for. My mind immediately whispered warnings. He's your mom's friend. He's dangerous in ways you can't name. Yet, there was curiosity entwined with that flutter, a strange, irresistible pull toward him. I noticed the small things about him, the faint scent of aged leather from his jacket, the whisper of a cologne that smelled like quiet confidence, the way his laughter softened the clamor around us. He didn't try to impress anyone, yet he commanded attention simply by being present, by being fully himself. It was impossible not to watch him, not to wonder what thoughts lay behind his deep, contemplative eyes. Our first conversation was brief, almost accidental. He asked me a simple question about my studies, a topic I normally shared casually with friends. But with him, it felt like an examination, not in the academic sense, but as if he genuinely wanted to understand me, my thoughts, my dreams, my hesitations. I found myself speaking more openly than I expected, drawn to the careful attention in his gaze. And when he smiled, that subtle, knowing smile that suggested understanding without judgment, my chest tightened, a quiet, unfamiliar ache. Even then, I sensed the boundaries. He was older, wiser, and somehow untouchable in a way that made me ache with both longing and fear. But in those moments, standing across from him in the warm glow of the living room, I realized that curiosity alone could be dangerous. And yet, I couldn't stop being drawn toward him. By the end of that evening, I carried more than a memory of his kindness. I carried a quiet fascination, an unspoken acknowledgement that this man, my mom's friend, was unlike anyone I had ever met. Something in me wanted to explore that pull, though I didn't yet know the depths it would reach, or the ways it might change me forever. After that first evening, I found myself noticing him more often, in ways I tried and failed to hide from myself. It wasn't the grand gestures that drew me closer, it was the quiet, deliberate moments, the subtle glances that seemed to linger just long enough to leave my pulse fluttering. At a small gathering a few days later, I caught him watching me from across the room, not with judgment, but with an attentiveness that felt almost tender. He didn't approach immediately, he never rushed, but even the awareness of being observed by him stirred something unfamiliar, something thrilling and yet gently frightening. Our first proper conversation outside the accidental handshake happened almost by chance. I had stepped into the kitchen for a glass of water, and he was there alone, tending to the teapot. He asked about a book I had been reading, a small detail I hadn't thought anyone had noticed. The question itself was simple, casual, but the way he asked, soft, patient, genuinely curious, made me pause. I felt an unusual warmth at being noticed, really noticed, for something so personal. And when I answered, he listened with that slow, deliberate focus that made me feel like my words mattered in ways they rarely did. It was in that small space, over the faint whistle of boiling water, that our first delicate connection formed. Our hands brushed as he handed me a cup of tea, and the touch, light as a feather, sent a shiver through me I couldn't explain. I quickly pulled my hand back, pretending it was accidental, yet I couldn't stop my mind from replaying the warmth of his palm. Every glance, every smile, every subtle gesture built a quiet tension between us, the kind of tension that hums in the air, impossible to ignore yet delicate enough to seem invisible to anyone else. I caught myself studying the way he moved, the slow tilt of his head when he considered my words, the way he shifted his weight slightly closer when he sensed hesitation or doubt in my voice. There was a gentleness to him, a kind of patience that seemed almost unnatural in its steadiness. And yet, beneath it, I sensed something more, a depth, a history, a quiet danger that made the pull toward him irresistible. I wanted to reach out, to speak more freely, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered cautions. My mother's friend, older, wise, untouchable. Still, the unspoken curiosity between us grew with every shared moment. I found myself laughing more easily in his presence, feeling lighter, even though my heart thrummed in a way I couldn't entirely understand. It wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper, a quiet acknowledgement of a connection I wasn't supposed to have, yet couldn't ignore. By the time we said goodbye that evening, I carried with me a subtle ache, a longing I didn't yet have a name for. And I knew, without admitting it even to myself, that this was the beginning of something far more complicated than I had ever expected. Every small gesture, every lingering glance, every gentle word would pull me further into a world I wasn't sure I was allowed to enter. By now, the quiet curiosity I felt toward him had grown into something more complicated, something that tugged at the edges of my mind when I least expected it. Every time I saw him, a rush of warmth would rise in my chest, a flutter I tried to dismiss as simple admiration. But I knew better. There was an undeniable tension in the air between us, a silent pulse that neither of us named but both felt. And with that tension came the sharp pang of guilt that this man, my mother's friend, had become the focus of my attention in a way that felt almost forbidden. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons that the conflict became undeniable. We had been walking through the park, the late spring sun filtering through the leaves and casting dappled shadows on the path. He talked easily, sharing a story about his work, a memory from years ago, but I could hardly focus on the words. My mind was consumed with the feel of his presence beside me, the subtle warmth radiating from his shoulder when we walked too close, the occasional brush of his fingers against mine as he adjusted something in my bag or handed me a folded map. Each touch, innocent in its intent, sparked a small surge of something I wasn't supposed to feel. I caught myself imagining what it would be like if the world weren't watching, if the boundaries that society and family imposed could simply vanish. And with that thought came fear. Fear of crossing lines, fear of disappointing my mother, fear of what it meant to want someone I wasn't supposed to want. Yet, at the same time, there was a thrill, a deep, intoxicating pull toward him that felt almost magnetic, impossible to resist. I found myself questioning everything I had believed about desire and propriety, realizing that my attraction wasn't just physical, but emotional. I wanted to be understood by him, to be seen in a way no one else ever had. He seemed aware of my hesitation. I noticed the brief pause in his step whenever our hands brushed, the gentle tilt of his head as he watched me with that quiet, patient gaze. It was as though he understood the battle raging inside me without needing a word. And in that understanding, I felt both comforted and terrified. Comforted, because there was a safety in his restraint. Terrified, because the very same restraint only made the tension between us more unbearable. Later that evening, alone in my room, I replayed our walk over and over in my mind. Every smile, every glance, every incidental touch seemed to burn with significance. I realized that the line between admiration and desire had blurred, leaving me suspended in a liminal space of uncertainty. I wanted him, I feared him, I respected him, all at once. And the more I tried to reconcile these conflicting emotions, the more impossible it felt to deny that he had become something I could neither control nor ignore. By the end of the day, one thing was clear. I was standing at the edge of a precipice, caught between longing and morality. And though I didn't yet know how or if I would ever cross it, I knew with quiet certainty that my life had irrevocably changed the moment I allowed myself to notice him, truly notice him. The first time I allowed myself to be truly vulnerable with him, it wasn't in a grand declaration or a dramatic confession. It happened quietly, in a moment that could have gone unnoticed by anyone else. We were sitting on the worn leather sofa in his study, the faint golden glow of a table lamp spilling across the room, casting shadows that softened the edges of the world. I had come to return a book I'd borrowed, but the conversation quickly drifted beyond literature into spaces I rarely explored with anyone. I found myself speaking of my insecurities, the self-doubt that gnawed at me during long nights, the fear that I wasn't living up to my own expectations, and the weight of always feeling like I needed to be good enough for everyone around me. Usually, I masked these feelings behind humor or silence, but with him I didn't. There was something in the way he listened, with a steady gaze that didn't judge or interrupt, that made it possible for me to speak freely. He responded with patience and a quiet, deliberate kindness, his voice soft and measured. He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he shared small pieces of his own experience, his own struggles, and the lessons he had learned along the way. In that moment, the age difference between us didn't feel like a barrier, it was a bridge. His wisdom felt grounding, like an anchor in the restless seas of my thoughts. And yet, the way he leaned slightly closer when I hesitated, the almost imperceptible touch of his hand near mine, made my heart pulse with something both terrifying and thrilling. I caught myself staring at the lines around his eyes, the quiet strength in his hands, the subtle warmth in his smile. Each detail seemed magnified, as though my senses had been heightened by the intensity of the moment. His presence was comforting, yes, but it also carried a danger, a tension between restraint and desire that I couldn't entirely decipher. And in that tension, I felt something new: trust. A trust one hadn't given to anyone else, a willingness to share pieces of myself I usually kept hidden. There was a pause, the kind that stretches longer than expected, filled with unspoken acknowledgement. I noticed the warmth radiating from his shoulder, the quiet steadiness of his breathing, and the soft weight of the book resting between us. It was intimate, yet not intrusive, a delicate balance that made every subtle gesture feel electric. For a brief moment, I imagined what it would be like to cross the invisible line that kept us apart. The thought both thrilled and frightened me, and I realized that the boundaries I had imposed on myself were beginning to blur. When I finally stood to leave, the connection lingered, heavier than the book I carried in my hands. The warmth of his presence seemed to follow me into the night, echoing in my mind with every quiet memory of his patience, his gaze, and the almost imperceptible brush of his fingers against mine. In that one evening, something profound had shifted between us. I wasn't just curious anymore, I was captivated. And I knew, deep down, that this connection would haunt me, challenge me, and change me in ways I wasn't yet ready to understand. The days that followed our quiet moments together were filled with a strange tension, one I hadn't expected. I found myself acutely aware of the way others might perceive our growing connection. Though no one had said a word, their presence seemed heavier, their glances more pointed. At family gatherings, I noticed the slight pause when he entered a room, the subtle way conversations shifted as if sensing something unspoken. My mother, ever perceptive, smiled easily, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and perhaps recognition of the subtle closeness I was trying so desperately to conceal. It was during one such gathering, a casual Sunday lunch at our home, that the conflict became almost unbearable. We had been discussing a new exhibition at a local gallery, and he had leaned slightly toward me to point out a detail in the brochure. The touch of his hand on mine was brief, but unmistakable, and I felt a flutter of warmth that both thrilled and panicked me. I quickly pulled back, my cheeks flushing, but I caught a small, knowing smile in his eyes. That smile was comforting, yet it carried a weight, a silent acknowledgement that we both knew the boundary we were approaching. As the afternoon wore on, I felt eyes lingering a little too long, whispers brushing past my ears, and imagined judgments pressing in on us from all sides. Even the smallest interactions, a shared laugh, a subtle brush of the shoulder, a prolonged gaze, seemed amplified under the scrutiny I imagined. I realized then how fragile our delicate connection truly was, suspended between desire and propriety, between curiosity and social expectation. Later, walking through the quiet streets toward a small cafe, I tried to untangle my thoughts. I questioned myself constantly. Am I imagining his attentiveness? Am I reading too much into simple kindness? Yet, every time he spoke, his voice calm and measured, or laughed softly at something I said, my doubts melted away. It was impossible to deny that something deeper had formed between us, a quiet, intimate bond that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. There were moments when I wondered if he, too, felt the weight of perception, the moral boundaries pressing against us. I noticed the subtle restraint in his gestures, the measured calm that belied the intensity one sometimes glimpsed in his gaze. His awareness of the social landscape, of the age difference, the connection to my mother, the delicate lines we must not cross, was as much a part of him as his kindness. And yet, he never pulled away completely. He maintained a careful balance between presence and distance, closeness and decorum. By the end of that day, the tension between us had grown, not in anger or conflict, but in the weight of unspoken rules, in the quiet knowledge that desire and propriety could never fully coexist. I realized that my fascination with him was no longer just about curiosity or admiration. It had become something profound, tangled with longing, restraint, and the awareness that the world would judge what we could barely acknowledge ourselves. And yet, despite the external pressures, I felt an undeniable pull toward him, one I knew I would follow carefully, cautiously, and perhaps inevitably. It was late evening when it finally happened, the moment I had been both longing for and fearing, the moment where the weight of unspoken words could no longer remain suspended. We were walking along a quiet, tree-lined avenue, the soft glow of streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement from an earlier drizzle. The world felt hushed, intimate, as if it had conspired to create a space where only we existed. I could feel his presence beside me, steady and patient, like a calm anchor in a storm of emotions I was only beginning to understand. I spoke first, my voice tentative, almost afraid of breaking the fragile balance between curiosity and propriety. I admitted the fascination I felt for him, the way his presence unsettled and comforted me all at once. I confessed how drawn I was to his calm wisdom, to the subtle warmth in his gaze, and to the way he made me feel seen in ways no one else had. Every word trembled with a mixture of fear, desire, and relief. Fear that I was stepping too close to forbidden territory, desire for a connection I could no longer deny, and relief that I had finally voiced what had been silently burning inside me. He stopped walking and turned toward me, his expression soft, eyes reflecting a depth of understanding I had only glimpsed in fragments before. His voice, low and deliberate, carried the weight of years of experience and quiet reflection. He admitted his own restraint, the careful vigilance he had maintained to honor boundaries, the conscious awareness of social expectations, and the respect he held for me and my family. And yet, he did not deny the connection, the pull, the subtle bond that had been growing between us. There was a long pause between us, the kind that stretches and thickens with unspoken emotion. The night air carried the faint scent of rain and the subtle warmth from the pavement, the quiet hum of distant traffic forming a gentle backdrop. His hand brushed against mine, not forcefully, but lingering just enough to send a shiver up my spine. In that simple gesture, the tension we had carried for weeks found a delicate resolution, a shared acknowledgement that we were on the same page, even if the road ahead remained uncertain. I realized then that the age difference, the societal expectations, and even the moral boundaries that had seemed so daunting were not walls, but contours, shaping the path of something profound rather than restricting it. His wisdom, patience, and gentle guidance were not constraints, but invitations to explore a connection built on respect, curiosity, and trust. And in that moment, I understood that our bond did not require rushing or defiance. It only required honesty, presence, and the courage to acknowledge what had always been quietly growing between us. As we continued walking, side by side in companionable silence, the air between us felt lighter, warmer, and charged with possibility. The first confessions had been made, and with them came a sense of acceptance of each other, of ourselves, and of the fragile, beautiful tension that made our connection so compelling. For the first time, I felt both exhilarated and safe, held not by force, but by understanding, patience, and mutual respect. The days after our confession were quiet, filled with a new awareness of each other that was both exhilarating and grounding. We were no longer dancing around the tension between us. Instead, it had transformed into something steady, a current flowing beneath the surface, invisible to the world but undeniable to us. Every interaction, a shared glance across a room, a subtle touch of hands, a soft laugh at something private carried weight and meaning, a language only we understood. One late afternoon, we found ourselves sitting in a small, sunlit park. The warmth of the golden hour spilled across the benches, brushing against our skin like a gentle caress. He had a book in his lap, and I rested my hands loosely together, leaning just slightly toward him. Words were unnecessary. The space between us hummed with shared understanding. The connection we had built was no longer fragile curiosity or secret longing. It had become something deeper, a trust formed through patience, restraint, and quiet observation of each other's hearts. I noticed the details that had captivated me from the beginning, the subtle lines around his eyes that spoke of years of experience, the calm strength in his hands, the warmth of his shoulder as it occasionally brushed mine. Each small gesture felt magnified, like the world had softened to let us exist in this intimate, shared bubble. And when our fingers touched briefly, accidental, yet deliberate in its simplicity, it was as if the moment itself held its breath. There was no rush, no overwhelming urgency to define what this meant beyond the present. We both understood the careful balance required, the age difference, the social expectations, the moral lines we had once feared crossing. And yet, the acknowledgement of our feelings created a new space where we could be together, cautiously, deliberately, and meaningfully. We talked softly about life, dreams, and the quiet thrill of discovering someone who truly understood you. Our voices blended with the rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children playing, and the faint hum of city life beyond the park. Every word, every pause, every shared silence was a reaffirmation of what had grown between us: respect, admiration, and a subtle, yet undeniable romantic connection. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, orange glow over the world, we rose together. Our hands brushed once more as we walked side by side, the simple gesture a quiet promise. We didn't need grand declarations. The intimacy of our connection had already been spoken through the small, meaningful moments that had defined our journey. I felt secure, cherished, and profoundly seen, not just by his kindness or wisdom, but by the way he had allowed me to exist fully, without judgment or expectation. As we parted for the evening, there was a lingering smile, a soft squeeze of the hand, and the quiet knowledge that this bond, though measured and respectful, was ours. In that moment, I realized that love didn't always need to shout. Sometimes it whispered in glances, lingered in gestures, and settled gently into the spaces between two people who had chosen to see and understand each other fully. And that was enough. If this story tugged at your heart or made you wonder about forbidden attraction, hit that like button. Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from, and which moment resonated with you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more slow burn age gap romances that linger long after the screen fades.